When talking about modern auteurs, directors with a really distinct sensibility, there is almost nobody who can compare to Peter Greenaway. At least, I think that's the case. This is only the second of his films that I've seen. A month ago, I saw The Cook, The Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, which is a great movie. That's probably his most famous film. And this movie, Drowning by Numbers, is probably his second most well-known. If you're a big Peter Greenaway fan, you're probably going to like all of his movies. In fact, you're probably going to love all of his movies. I can't give you a superfan's perspective here. Maybe that's a good thing, but I'll try to break down this really interesting movie. I'm not going to spend too much time comparing the two, but let me start with some similarities just as an introduction to the movie, I guess. These are both remarkably well-crafted movies with endless texture and tons of details. When I was a kid, I had some picture books called I Spy. Bill Cosby was not involved, as far as I know. These books were big spreads, big pictures where you had arrangements of lots of different odd household objects, sometimes sculpted into various scenes. And you were supposed to find things in them. This movie kind of reminds me of that. The set decorators are really the heroes of the film. Nothing in the frame in any scene seems like it's there by chance. Peter Greenaway didn't walk outside with a camera and start filming. Instead, everything was pulled together from all the corners of the world and arranged just so. A bit like an I Spy book. And I think there may even be things to spy amongst all the knickknacks and tchotchkes. This movie doesn't really seem to take place in the real world at all. I'll come back to this more later. I guess if I had one word to describe the style of the film, it would be embellishment. I think for some people, the closest comparison would be Wes Anderson. Maybe Wes Anderson crossed with Pedro Almodovar. That's a decent comparison, although in some ways those are just two directors that have a distinct style or that really care about materiality. I'm not sure the comparison is particularly deep. And I think, Peter Greenaway deserves to be thought of on his own, not in terms of other directors. Anyway, and everything I just described is true for this movie as well as The Cook, The Thief, etc., etc. Maybe the biggest thing that defines both of these movies, though, is simply creativity and ingenuity. And I'm not just talking about how the movie looks, but the dramatic fabric of this movie also is fairly unconventional. It's fun to see how things unfold. It's fun to see just how the movie is constructed, how they tell a story in a certain way. Another similarity is that we've got another great Michael Nyman score in this movie. Let me talk a little bit about what happens in Drowning by Numbers. This is a movie centered around three generations of women who all have the same name, Sissy Colpitts, and all drown their husband. Sissy, interesting name. Maybe it's reading too much into that choice. At first, you might mistakenly think that they're related. Could mean different things in different countries, spelled with a C, of course. Anyway, all three drown their husbands. There's a local coroner named Madgett. Sounds almost like some sort of warlock. Looks almost like some sort of warlock. And in fact, the actor who plays Madgett was in The Lord of the Rings. The women, sissies, they kind of recruit Madgett to help with the crimes. I'm not sure recruit's the right word. They pull him into their scheme one way or the other. Madgett has a son named Smut, another interesting choice, who narrates the film, sort of. The story itself isn't particularly complicated, but there's a lot of other angles thrown in. For example, Madgett and Smut keep track not just of human deaths, as coroners typically would, but of everything that dies in their little village. And they number these things and light off fireworks to honor them. They have sort of an actuarial side hustle, you might say. The numbers 1 through 100 appear throughout the movie, tacked on to one thing or another. In some ways, these numbers seem to be attached to deaths, but maybe not exactly. It's kind of fun to see where they pop up, kind of playful. And if you're really into the movie, you might be able to pause here and there to play I Spy and ascribe particular meaning to certain numbers and where they appear. For the average viewer, that's not really necessary. This movie seems to have a lot of that kind of depth, or at least the illusion of it. I said that Smut narrates the film. Really, what this means is that he describes to the audience a series of games. Some of these are played just by him, some by Madgett, some by the whole community. Some of the games are lighthearted and whimsical, some are bizarre, and some are very serious. That kind of describes the tone of the film as well. I guess if you had to shove this into a genre, you would probably say dark comedy, but that's really selling things short. it's interesting to see the processes emerging in this movie. Like I said, it's fun to see how the film fits together. It's fun to see the logic of the movie. The logic of this film is not something conventional. It's not something that you would know before you watch the movie. It's something that you learn on the fly, something that's taught to you a bit like a game in some ways. And yeah, it's nice to see all the little rhythms of life in this mysterious place emerge. For instance, you see, here is what happens when Madget and Smut first arrive at the scene of some death. They're going to tag it in a certain way. They're going to set off the firework. They're going to label it depending on the day of the week. Later, you'll kind of learn how about a gravedigger character who they will then summon later to bury the animal or whatever has passed. Like I said, it's just kind of interesting to see the clockwork of this movie. Collections and games are two of the most conspicuous themes in the movie. I'm using the term collection somewhat loosely here, just to talk about a way that the world can be organized. So Madget and Smut, they don't take home every corpse they find, probably a good thing, but they order them. They make sense out of them in some ways. There are also more explicit collections in the movie. For instance, there are 100 things that start with the letter S in Smut's room, and 100 things that start with the letter M in Madget's room. I didn't count them, but apparently that's the case. I'll take the word of random contributor to IMDb Trivia on that one. There's actually 100 things that start with the letter T in this room, but they're all off camera, sadly. You can't see them. I've always been kind of struck by what Walter Benjamin says about collectors in his preface to the Arcades Project. Oh, I always forget when I'm going to mention a book to take it from the shelf, which is over there. Very interesting sort of preface to this work, which is itself a kind of weird collection, talking about how when you collect things, you're freeing them from their worldly positions and setting aside their traditional use value. You're conceptualizing them in some other value system, your own value system, your values as a connoisseur of sorts. This is the idealization of objects. I don't know, I always thought that was kind of an interesting idea, collection as a coping mechanism for this kind of material world that we live in, where artifacts are just scattered all over the place, used in all kinds of different ways to unify these things, to bring them back in some ways to some sort of, I don't know, significance is interesting. Collection as a coping mechanism. Anyway, there's collections in this movie, and more generally, Smut and Madget seem to have kind of a way of looking at things that is not the way that most people would see them. They have their own systems. And in some ways, this is delightfully quirky, but I think there's also a satirical bend here, with Greenaway posing a larger question about how people make sense of the world. Games play a very similar role. The games that Madget dreams up are, again, delightfully quirky. They have some kind of logic. In some ways, they can even seem profound. The descriptions of the game almost read like fairy tales. The instructions seem to be for kids. They're read by a child. And this paternalism of the games is somewhat pointed. Paternalism of the games. I mean, who came up with this stuff? Who decided that this is the way that games should be played, that this is a game, but something else is not a game, that these are the rules, that this is the way it has to be? Both collections and games seem to be, while delightful in a way, also poking at some kind of arbitrariness. Some kind of pervasive arbitrariness floating through every corner of society. At times, this might seem like a superficial movie with all its concerns over style, all of its little tweaks and embellishments. But really, I think it's more of a movie about superficiality, which is a totally different thing. Now, what would any of this have to do with the more explicit plot in the film? With the unhappy marriages that drive wives to kill their husbands? Again, maybe it's a question of arbitrariness. Who came up with marriage anyway? Who set up the archetypical relationships between woman and man? One way to think about what this movie might be pointing towards is to look at where it intersects with the real world. Like I said, this movie doesn't really take place in the real world. It is some sort of strange fairy tale. Most of the characters are really embellished. But what are they an embellishment of? Can we figure it out? The husbands are probably the easiest characters to read. The first two are slobs. Bellamy, the third, is a bit trickier because he actually seems like a pretty reasonable guy. We have the townspeople as well, like the runners, the Bogners, just the various townspeople. And these seem like your typical British blokes, I guess. You can read a lot of the men in the film as being fairly lousy, but in a particularly British way that feels a little more incisive, I guess. Which is in some ways, maybe not too different from how the Cook, the Thief, etc., works, where the movie really hinges on a character who's this sort of blaspheming aristocrat. Madget is a little different, a little more complicated. He's some kind of bureaucrat getting his authority from somewhere and lavishing in how justicious he thinks he is, while maybe not exactly living up to that idea. So far, the word I would use is provincialism. Provincialism all over the place. The small town mechanics and their arbitrariness. The women in the movie are a bit trickier to read. The film is constructed with them at the center, which makes it very tempting to think of them as the heroes. I'm not sure this is really borne out. I don't want to get into the ending too much, but I don't think this is really a triumphant film about girl power, although it might be tempting to read it that way. And, you know, maybe a woman is due a triumph in a loveless marriage for once. But I don't know. I'll leave it to you if you want to think of the wives as victims of this swollen provincial state, or if they have some share of the blame. To me, this movie isn't about a gender war so much as a portrait of how arbitrary provincial ideas bring about broken relationships. Murdering your husband isn't a triumph, it's a symptom of a system that doesn't really work. Par for the course in this world of slobs, decay, and idiosyncratic systems that come to define the world. Now, one minor comparison to The Cook, the Thief, etc., is that that movie has a more clear-cut revenge plot line. Bad character gets his comeuppance, I guess. My only real hesitation about that movie was that it was maybe too simplistic in that regard. This movie is a bit more nuanced. Like I said, it's fairly clear that the third murder isn't entirely justified, maybe not justified at all. I guess on some level you can think of this movie as a satire, but there's a lot more to it than comedy. I think these ideas of games and collections make for an incisive movie. I say that the movie is mainly whimsical, but there are a few moments where things are much more serious. To me, the apex of the film comes right before the final sequence. This is when Madget and the third sissy are in the car together, and the short scene that immediately follows that, which I won't spoil. Here, the movie downshifts from being something quirky to something poignant, profound, something really beautiful, honestly. And I think this is remarkable, especially because the movie plays so much by its own rules, because there's so much of its own dramatic logic, because it seems so weird and kind of quirky. And then it also can get serious, and it can become a very beautiful and poignant film as well. I think that's a really, really cool thing about this movie. Rare. This scene with Sissy and Madget is interesting. In some ways, it's one of the harder scenes to watch in the movie. Madget and Sissy both bring, I guess, a totally broken idea of a relationship to each other. I think this is in some ways the most sincere scene in the film, and maybe this points most directly at a certain type of broken relationship in the real world, I guess. I don't know. Now, I've mainly praised the movie, but I will say that I don't think it's as good as The Cook, the Thief, etc. For one thing, I don't think the ending of Drowning by Numbers is very good. Of course, this movie has loose ends all over the place, and plenty of little moments that don't really make sense. Or maybe that make sense in the strange world of Peter Greenaway, but not really the one I live in. And I get it. Maybe if you're really into this movie, you're kind of lavishing in all the details. I think there's still a lot of loose ends here and there. But that doesn't really bother me that much. I don't really mind that the ending of this movie doesn't resolve things. I think it's maybe a little bit messy, but the whole movie is messy, and that's fine. It's kind of cool. I think the bigger problem, which is an issue for most of the movie, is that it just, to me, felt too impersonal. In The Cook, the Thief, etc., the conflict is extremely visceral. The plot of that movie is fairly simplistic, but you feel it. I do think this movie has some sincere and beautiful sequences in it, like I mentioned, but I was not anywhere as involved emotionally as I have been with other movies. I would also say that although I praise this movie for using collections and games, not merely to be quirky and fun, but to actually say something about the world, to be incisive, I do think that the movie is maybe still a little bit more fluffy than I would like. You do spend quite a while playing along with the games. I guess that's fine, but it did, despite what I said earlier, actually feel a little bit superficial to me, but that's probably a matter of personal taste more than anything. It's impossible to deny how creative this movie is, and for that alone, I recommend it. I think it also has a mercurial beauty to it that is rare. While this has not shot to the top of the list of Peter Greenaway films for me, the list of 2, it's obviously still a great movie. And I think it's, again, perhaps being so extreme stylistically, it's one of these things where if you're into it, you're probably really going to like it. So overall, really cool movie, and it's likely that I'll be doing some more Peter Greenaway movies on the channel in the future. I think that as we get into some of the less famous ones, we may find murkier waters with even more to decipher. But Drowning by Numbers, for the most part, fun movie that I think anybody should check out.